Hi and warm welcome, everyone. My name is Menina Chow. I'm part of the SAP community team and your host during today's community call. We have today's topic, Define Your Enterprise Integration Strategy with the SAP Integration Solution Advisory Methodology. And with me is Konstantin Heine. He's product manager for the integration strategy and the cross architecture. He's responsible for SAP Integration Solution Advisory Methodology and topics regarding the enterprise architecture. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes to remind you, you're always welcome to raise questions. Use the Q&A button to submit your questions. We'll have time at the end definitely to address your questions. And you can use the chat like now, where you can interact with us and have a look as we are adding links while Konstantin is speaking. With that, I'm very happy to hand over to you, Konstantin, and kick it off with the session.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Yeah, also warm welcome from my side. My name is Konstantin Heine, and as Menina just said out, I'm a product manager in the cross-architecture product management. And today I'm going to give you some information and overview and also a couple of deep dive slides on the SAP Integration Solution Advisory Methodology. So what you will take away from this call today is you should be able afterwards to explain what the SAP Integration Solution Advisory Methodology is all about, why we've introduced this methodology, and especially how you as a partner, as a customer, how you can apply this methodology and bring everything that is inside into action. Before we start, you probably know that our disclaimer, so I will also mention a couple of items that are on our roadmap. So just note that a couple of features and functions are not clear yet. So please keep that in mind when listening to this webinar. So let's have a quick look at the agenda today. So I will kick it off today with an introduction on the SAP integration plan in the cloud. So as you might know, everything we do, especially in the integration space, is part of a larger context. So I also give you an introduction into the SAP integration strategy as such. And right afterwards, we will deep dive into the SAP Integration Solution Advisory Methodology. Afterwards, I will provide you with some links to additional resources. I will also let you know, this is probably the most burning question, how to get access to the ISAM template. And I will also summarize the key facts of this webinar afterwards in the key takeaways. We will have a dedicated Q&A session in the end that will be moderated by Nina. Nevertheless, I will keep an eye on the Q&A window. So maybe if you drop your question there, I will already pick some questions up that fits into the context. Okay, then first, let's have a look at SAP's integration plan in the cloud. So you probably know that the overall SAP strategy is all about the intelligent enterprise. And this famous strategic diagram you can see here, that we also call the burger diagram, summarizes pretty well what the integration and also the intelligent enterprise strategy is all about. You can see here different layers, and everything that is spanning across all of our solutions and technology is the layer of business processes. So we have defined a couple of end-to-end processes that lead to cash or design to operate. And of course, these business processes are enabled by technology and applications. The applications include, as part of the intelligence suite, for example, SAP S/4HANA, but also our LOB solutions, for example, the custom experience solutions. And the underlying platform is the business technology platform, followed then by the infrastructure layer. Now, you might ask yourself how fits integration into the game, and I've chosen to show this slide because integration cannot be seen as an isolated capability or quality of this whole strategy here. Integration is, of course, part of business processes. Of course, you have from a business process perspective integration, for example, between different departments, but also from a business process perspective as such. But also integration plays a huge role in application integration. If you want to transfer master data from A to B or transactional data. And of course, there's the technology aspect. So which integration platform to use, for example, when to use API management. So basically technology capabilities that support your integration requirements. So you can see integration is all over the place, and it is not part of just one layer here, but actually it's embedded everywhere. And this is why we have launched already a couple of months ago the so-called integration strategy paper. I will provide the link afterwards as well, but I just would like to point you already now to this integration picture because this document includes all the relevant information on the strategic direction. It provides some information around our end-to-end business processes, and it also includes some highlights. So why is the integration strategy so important? And let's start with some numbers here. So if you look at this Oxford economics study that was done in August 2020, you can see that 94% of integration leaders improve profit margins. So you see integration is actually very important and plays a huge role here. And 88% of integration leaders increase transparencies into their operations. So they're able to track, for example, certain items end to end from the beginning to the end and have very tightly integrated business processes. And then there's the surprising number that only 25% of enterprises would describe themselves completely integrated. And this is quite surprising because integration is a topic that is around for some time already. And you can still see that there's a huge gap here that companies do not have very good integrated systems or actually an integration strategy in the company. And if you now take it one level deeper and you look at the persona of an enterprise architect, for example, there are very concrete challenges these persons face. So you probably observed that yourself already in the past couple of months or even years, that there is technology all around us. So you see a lot of different buzzwords, for example, like robotic process automation, big data, mobile, hybrid system landscapes, and so on. And all of these words or buzzwords are flying around and have to be taken into a structure so you can basically work on it. And derived from these buzzwords, there are four main areas that enterprise architectures care about. For example, building a future integration architecture that is future proven and fulfills all the requirements, not only from business side, but also from IT side. Of course, a lot of companies have to do with hybrid integration platforms, but also a hybrid application landscape, for example, when on-premise and cloud is mixed. You want to have an integration governance. Of course, you want to steer integration requirements and make sure that certain requests are channeled into the right direction to fulfill them. And in the end, of course, agility and speed is also key here because it's not all about IT discussions, but of course, you also want to be agile, not only as a company, but also from IT side. So you see a lot of challenges here, and you might now ask yourself, okay, how do I overcome these challenges? So what's the toolkit that SAP provides to really bring these topics into an order and allow me as a company, as a customer, as a partner to execute on this strategy? And the answer is quite simple. It is the SAP Integration Solution Advisory methodology. This methodology is around for some time now, and this is the usual representation, the graphical representation of this methodology. The important things first, so the methodology is open. It is not only tailored only to SAP content, but you can also extend it to your own needs. And also important, it's for free. So it's nothing that is somehow gated to get access. Again, I will let you know later how that works. But the integration solution methodology is a comprehensive methodology that allows you to really tackle the challenges that I've just presented to you. So number one, it's a technology agnostic framework to define and execute the strategy. Very often we observe, especially in the enterprise architecture space, that a lot of assets are created for the documentation sake, but the execution, so really bringing it to life, is a challenge afterwards. And this is actually something that we want to tackle with this methodology. We pre-deliver certain artifacts, for example, integration use case patterns, but also architecture blueprints and best practices. And it covers different integration dimensions. So when you remember this tech cloud, this word cloud I've just shown you, you will get actually some kind of structure out of AZA that provides you with the right direction and actually with the structure for these topics. Now, how does this methodology work? And we have defined a step-by-step approach from definition to execution of the strategy. So a lot of companies, and you remember the number, only 25% of the integration leaders would describe themselves as completely integrated. So a lot of companies are actually at the very initial state of a non-systematic integration. So integration requirements in the company are handled ad hoc, so mostly centrally, for example, by IT teams. And whenever there's a new project in the company, you as an integration consultant, for example, as an enterprise architect, you have to pick up this request and treat it individually, which of course doesn't scale. Now, so the integration methodology comes into to place here. So the first step always is to assess your integration strategy. You can describe this as an as-is analysis. So you do an inventory of your integration landscape. And then the next step would be to design your integration platform. So basically you take whatever you have and you define the directions for each and every integration aspect, which is then enriched with integration best practices. And the last step is to build a so-called practice of empowerment. So really bring it to life and make sure that also the organizational aspects in your company are taken into account. And you're able as a company not only to execute the strategy you've defined, but also make sure that people in your company follow the guidelines and also scale with that. Now, we will now deep dive into each and every topic, of course, with the non-systematic integration, because this is what we want to avoid, but the other four. And this is why we get started first with the first step, the assess your integration strategy step. So the first step, as I said, is kind of an as-is analysis. So where do you stand as a company? So where is your integration strategy in terms of maturity? And what you execute, covered or supported by the integration solution methodology, is to scope certain focus areas. So you probably know already where you need some improvement, where you want to detail out, for example, your integration strategy. And this is why we provide as part of these steps so-called building blocks and integration domains that help you based on a use case driven approach to assess your integration strategy. Again, some driving topics here are, of course, the need to cover new integration patterns, for example, business-driven, but also technology-driven, implementation of new cloud applications. So still a lot of companies do not have a complete cloud strategy in place, especially not a cloud integration strategy. And one of the most important topics is, of course, also transition to SAP S/4HANA, which is ongoing at many customers at the moment. And of course, there are some other topics like standardization and governance, but also mergers and acquisitions. But looking at this list, probably the most common ones are new implementation projects that are started. So how do you concretely do that? So number one is, as part of the methodology, we provide so-called integration domains. So the first step is you cluster from an outside-in perspective your integration scenarios by domain. So for example, you can see here that on the left-hand side, you have the so-called user-centric applications. So you can think about the mobile app that you provide as a company, but also a good example is a commerce web shop that you provide to your end customers. And in the center, you can see the cloud space. So for example, different SAP cloud applications, but also non-SAP applications that run in the cloud. Below that, the whole on-premise system landscape, and on the right-hand side, the so-called real-world objects around IoT integration. Now, if you take this commerce webshop, for example, you would assess the scenarios used in your company. So in case of a webshop, of course, you would scope here the user-centric applications. And then depending on whether this webshop, for example, is integrated with a cloud system or an on-premise system, you would either scope the user-to-cloud domain or the user-to-on-premise domain. And I bet also if you're running an on-premise landscape with minimum one cloud solution, of course, also the on-premise to cloud domain is in scope. And this will be, for this webinar, my example that I will execute with you. So to summarize, we have in total 7 integration domains, and the very first step is to scope the domains based on what you use as a company. The next step would then be to scope the so-called integration styles. So you transition basically the domains into thinking what type or which style of integration does this domain in this case represent. So for example, if you take the web shop and maybe the web shop backend as an example. This would be, you can see it here in dark blue, the user integration, because your end user is in focus here. And this scenario, this persona integrates from a business perspective with the commerce backend. But in case you take it one step further, of course, you recognize that there are master data and transactional data involved here. And let's say this backend is then integrated with your SAP S/4HANA system or SAP ERP system. You would also scope the so-called process integration style, because this is taking care of all the integration scenarios related to master data transaction, for example, and transactional data integration. So we provide these different integration styles as part of the ISIN template. And you can see here on the right-hand side, basically the rough description. It's just an example here. It's not the full list that I present here, but you can see some main characteristics of these integration styles. For example, in this case, process integration. There's the objective of changing business processes, so making sure that you support from an IT side the business processes, and there are a couple of characteristics associated with it. So once you've now defined the integration domains and the integration styles, it's creating a list more or less and making sure you cover everything that you would like to take in scope of your integration strategy. You bring it into a matrix, and the matrix has on one axis the use case patterns, on the other axis the integration styles. So you basically bring both together. And afterwards, you get to a list of use case patterns, and you can see it here in this matrix that I'm showing you. So if you remember the example here, for example, integrating a cloud system with an on-premise system, we would, of course, be here in the process integration style. And you can see here, for example, certain use case patterns like A2A, application to application integration, but also master data integration or some other integration use case patterns. So this is a list of different use case patterns. This is also documented as part of the template and allows you as a next step to detail it out and to refine it a little bit and cluster it a little bit. So your integration scenarios are basically then assigned to one or the other use case patterns. So again, the first step is concluded with this one. And as I mentioned before, this first step of the whole methodology is all about the as-is analysis. And you can see by assigning certain use case patterns to your scenarios, you could also go into the analytics space or the user integration space, for example, mobile integration or chatbot integration here. You create a full list of different use case patterns that apply to your company. So it's only already an individual list of your integration scenarios. Once you've completed this assessment, we would enter the next step as part of the methodology, which is the design your hybrid integration platform step. So the objective of this step is to map out the use case patterns and the integration technologies. So far, you've probably already recognized that we haven't talked about technology or applications at all. Of course, you look at your company IT applications, but we haven't talked about SAP technology. So for example, whether to use the SAP integration suite or SAP PIPO for an integration scenario. This would be part of this step now. So you basically map everything that is part of your analysis of the first step to technology recommendations that are provided by SAP. Again, as it is an open methodology, of course, you can also include some non-SAP technology recommendations here. What we deliver is part of the ISIN template, but also as part of our CIO guides, for example, is the SAP recommendation that you can, of course, enhance with your own individual recommendations that you maybe defined in your IT department. So when do you do that, or what's the context of this whole exercise? Of course, it has to do a lot of with enterprise architecture strategy. Of course, it's also related to future application landscape definitions. So for example, if you plan a transition from PIPO to the integration suite, but it's also related to investment decisions. For example, if you now identify for a new project, a lot of new integration use case patterns that you haven't covered before with technology, this next step also allows you to identify a fitting technology and then also justify certain investments, for example. So how does that look like concretely. The technology or integration technology mapping now takes the integration styles and the use case patterns one level deeper. We will use our example again, the integration between an on-premise and the cloud system. And remember, the integration style that we used was the green one here on the left, the process integration style. The use case pattern P1, let's say this is the application to application use case pattern in our example, is now mapped to an integration technology. So in this case, if you, for example, transfer data from A to B, from a cloud to an on-premise system, the SAP recommendation, the general recommendation, for example, is leveraging the SAP integration suite for this example. And this is the integration technology that would be mapped here. But of course, we know that maybe you're running already an SAP PI, PO on-premise instance landscape. So this would be probably in this case be classified as a reasonable alternative to the general recommendation SAP integration suite. So you see there's actually an end-to-end relationship here between use case patterns and technologies. So what we try to do here and support you with this template is really to cluster your integration requirements and then to identify the right technology or the best fitting technology, because right technology would actually mean that there's only one choice for it. But you will see in a second that there may be a couple of options available. So this is an example of the process integration style. You can see here we focus on the on-premise to cloud, and as I mentioned before, the ones highlighted here in green, cloud to cloud, on-premise to cloud, and on-premise to on-premise are the ones relevant here. And you can see on the right-hand side for example, recommended technology, the SAP integration suite, with all the capabilities. For example, you're leveraging prepackaged integration content, but also using the integration advisor capability, but also the open connectors that are part of the integration suite. Of course, the same recommendation would also be available for other integration styles and use case patterns, but could also include in this example here as an alternative an on-premise system landscape. So again, this is just an example because we cannot go in terms of timing into the details here. But if you take a look at at our template and at the methodology into detail after this webinar, you will see that there are a couple of alternatives available here. But this is just to show you how such a technology mapping recommendation could look like. So once you have then identified all the technology recommendations and you have reviewed the strategy, also with the supporting documents that we provide, again, also the links to the CIO guide and other documents will follow in the end, you would enrich this whole recommendation by integration best practices. There are two types of integration best practices, of course, the ones provided by SAP, some general rules that I will introduce in a second. But maybe you as a company, you also have own integration best practices. So there are companies, for example, with a cloud-first approach. So probably cloud on-premise solutions would be overruled by a company governance regulation that, for example, on-premise integration landscape wouldn't be suitable for this, although from a pure technology perspective, this would be an option based on the methodology. So the objective of this step is really to safeguard integrations, not only in line with SAP recommendations, but also with your organizational recommendations for us, and also to achieve transparency. So to make sure that also other units in your company have access to the recommendations and are able to, for example, consume so-called architecture blueprints. And this is actually at the core of this step. So to define architecture blueprints, we provide some of them, and I will show some of them in a second, but also to define do's and don'ts for integration scenarios, because it's not only about defining the integration scenarios in terms of which technology to use, but also when you implement the scenario, when you really do, for example, proof of concept, you should provide for the integration developers, for example, a set of rules that they should follow to really keep in line with your integration strategy from an operational perspective. So the architecture blueprints, again, the next step from the metrics. So you remember the use case pattern metrics to the so-called architecture blueprints. So in this case, we said we focus in this example on the application to application landscape use case pattern, and the sample architecture blueprints that are part of our methodology, for example, include here number 1 and 2, the A2A integration on-premise to cloud and the A2A integration cloud to cloud. There are a lot of other architecture blueprints included in our methodology, for example, around master data integration, but also UI integration and embedded analytics, for example. For this example, again, I will still focus on the on-premise to cloud architecture blueprints. So how does such a blueprint look like? And it's more or less a slide that summarizes all the different integration touch points and the integration blueprint in kind of a graphical representation, first of all. So the integration style is usually listed on the left. Then on the right, you have, and this is again the template slide, the ability to select certain BTP stencils. You can also select more and document your own integration style here on this template from a system landscape architecture diagram perspective. Of course, you don't have to do it here in PowerPoint. You might also use enterprise architecture tools or other tools that you use to document your system landscapes in, but this is just, a starting point where you can document your architecture. And again, as part of our sample architectures, of course, this is already pre-filled. So how does such an architecture blueprint look like? So this is the example here. This is the architecture blueprint for our application-to-application integration on-premise to cloud. This is the info sheet. So this is basically, if you think about an inventory, the first page that provides a description of this architecture blueprint. In this case, the description, for example, includes information that on-premise and cloud applications are integrated via, for example, your demilitarized zone in your network. And it also lists different SAP technologies involved here. So for example, SAP Integration Suite, here still called Cloud Integration. Maybe you use API management, use, for example, the SAP API Business Hub for prepackaged content, but also the SAP Cloud Connector might one of the components here that are relevant. You then have two sections when to apply that. So this is basically where you provide the rules to your integration teams and also, for example, to business architects that raise integration requirements. And you also describe a little bit how to apply that. So we, in our architecture blueprints, provide links to tutorials, for example, to blog series in the SAP community, but also webinars. But you, as a company, of course, you can extend these blueprints and include company-specific information in it. In here, we also include an example. So you can also look at that. In this case, for example, SAP Cloud for Customer Integration with SAP ERP. And if you then look at the concrete graphical representation of this architecture blueprint, this is how it could look like, right? So again, on the left-hand side, you have the integration style, in this case, application-to-application integration. Sorry, actually the use case pattern here. You have different characteristics. So things from a capability perspective, operational perspective, that should be supported here, like message routing, like splitting messages and so on. And on the right-hand side, you have the graphical representation with the cloud application on top. Then below that, the SAP Integration Suite as part of the SAP Business Technology Platform. This is, of course, again, for the prepackaged content connected to the SAP API Business Hub. And then you have the connectivity via the secure tunnel to your demilitarized zone cloud connector, and then via several firewalls, depending on the security setup, looks like the connection to your SAP on-premise landscape. And this is, again, just one example. So for every use case pattern, we provide this architecture blueprint, and we know that a lot of companies build on that. So it's not like you take this and apply it one-to-one, but of course you have different LLB applications. Again, you have maybe also non-SAP application landscape systems in your landscape. And this is why this is simply intended to give you some guidance, and then you copy the template and you create your own blueprints based on your own requirements and based on your individual system landscape. I also mentioned at the beginning that the do's and don'ts that you specify is one of the most important things, because you want to provide integration developers guidance here. And this is why we've listed here just some of them. For example, that you leverage integration packages wherever possible. So it provides actually a quicker time to implement integration scenarios compared to building that on your own. but also certain recommendations like decoupling of applications via asynchronous messaging and events, so they don't have to be available all the time, and you can do some kind of error handling and also monitoring here, but also some other recommendations that are part of our template here. And again, as mentioned before, this can be, of course, or should be expanded by your own company guidelines, because you might have, again, some kind of governance rules and some regulations in your company that should be associated with each and every architecture blueprint. So now that you have defined or actually assessed your integration strategy, you have defined your technology direction and also the best practices, you now have a set of different architecture blueprints. So this allows you already, whenever a new request comes in, to ideally open your drawer and take one blueprint out of it and tell the requester, this is how we do it in our company, this is how the integration would look like in your specific scenario. Now, there's one aspect that is very often forgotten, which is the organizational aspect, the company aspect. Because, of course, it doesn't scale if you just produce a lot of diagrams and PowerPoint slides, for example. But in case no one uses it, it's more or less just for documentation purposes. So the fourth step of our methodology is to enable a practice of empowerment. So the objective is here really to establish integration as a discipline, to really make sure that integration is seen as something strategically important and not just something that is delivered by integration developers. And of course, there are a couple of different entry points for integration requirements. I mentioned at the beginning already, there might be some business projects running, maybe you have a transition in front of you. And of course, this should scale. So you should be able to build from an organizational perspective a team or an organizational unit, for example, that covers integration requests and make sure that this is also delivered. So what we provide, and this is again just a sample to build on as part of our methodology, is, for example, a list of different integration personas you have. For example, integration architects, enterprise architects, integration developers, business owners, and so on. So we provide, as part of the template, a list of personas that helps you to classify all the stakeholders that are involved in the integration requirements process. For this webinar, I will just focus on one aspect, which is the so-called Integration Center of Excellence. Again, there's the integration strategy that I've just outlined with the definition and the execution of it. There are things around the hybrid integration platform, the second step of ISAM and the integration best practices. And you have different development or integration personas that are present in your company and that have to execute this strategy and make sure that everything you've defined as part of the strategy with the help of the methodology is also executed in the right way. So for example, you have the integration developers, so a persona that is pretty deep into integration topics. So probably persons that can develop new integration flows in the integration suite, but also know all the technical details of the integration scenarios. And then you, for example, also have API or application developers that have to deal with integration requirements. And one persona that is very often forgotten, but we also observe based on customer feedback that this persona is getting more and more prominent and important is the so-called citizen integrator, or people who from time to time want to execute some integration requirements. So if you think, for example, about a decentralized integration team, maybe there are people in business units that have an affinity to IT and want to quickly, in a kind of low-code, no-code fashion, connect to systems, maybe for a proof of concept. You also have to provide the ability for these persons and the option to execute the integration strategy. So as part of this step of our methodology, it's also should think about not only providing the deep technical details to your integration developers, but also to make it accessible for people who do not have a deep technology knowledge and, for example, address the citizen integrators to allow them to identify the right integration patterns and the right blueprints for their scenarios. So in the end, integration should also be a kind of self-service on well-defined standards. And this is what we provide as part of the methodology. Again, I don't have included everything here, but this is where we provide you with some additional assets that allow you to discuss within your company how you could, for example, build such an integration center of excellence. As part of this is, of course, the integration governance process. So from the initial request to the delivery of an integration scenario is also part of it. This scenario is a very simplified example that I showed to you. You can see here the three personas. On top, you have the swim lane with the integration requester, so a person that requests an integration scenario, for example, out of an implementation project. You have the integration developer, so someone who knows the integration platforms by heart and is really a technical expert. And you have the integration center of excellence, so some kind of centralized team, for example, but it could also be some kind of self-service. So it all starts with the specification of integration requirements. And based on the input, you then, as an integration developer, determine the integration technology. And this can be done, again, with the help of our integration solution advisory methodology. So with everything I've shown to you, so the integration domains, the integration styles, the use case patterns, the architecture blueprints. And based on this, you can already do some kind of pre-assessment for the technology direction. You would then decide, does the technology decision fulfill the requirements? So everything you've provided as part of your integration governance. And if no, so if the whole rule set, the whole scope of different architecture options that you've defined for your company does not provide a clear direction here or clear recommendation, it would be a case-by-case decision. So this would be, for example, in case of a whole new technology that is required here. But in case there's already something in your inventory, you would classify it whether it is a simple integration scenario or it is a complex scenario. So in case it is a simple scenario, it's my example, you open your drawer, there's an architecture blueprint for it. There are actually not many questions around it, and you have a clear recommendation how to implement this integration scenario, because based on our methodology, you've developed already a recommendation for it. If this is a scenario that is not trivial, and this is maybe not fully covered by one of the blueprints, and that maybe doesn't exist, we can also think about a scenario where you have multiple entities in the company, and maybe one entity is already using this scenario, but the other one is not. But in case there's really a new scenario involved here, you would have to develop this integration scenario. In this case, again, our methodology can help with our integration scenarios and the APIs, but also with the best practices that we have. So in the end, you can see, although this process here is very simplified, everything that is the core of ISAM is really to provide you with the ability to standardize and make the integration requirements process as efficient as possible. But in case there are really new integration requirements, the methodology, our template should also provide you with some artifacts that help you to really also support the more complex integration requirements. So this was a quick run through our template and our methodology. Again, the comprehensive methodology, the template is much larger than what I've just shown you. This is just an extract. And this is why I would also point you to some additional resources we have available that you can consult to really get more information, but also to dive deeper into this topic. So first of all, we have some guides available. The first one, this is, I already mentioned that our integration strategy paper, this is more business outcome focus. So this would be probably a good starting point if you want to get a generic overview on SAP's integration strategy, but also our integration plan in the cloud. When it gets more technical, the technology focus, we have provided 2 guides. I will start on the right because this is the most comprehensive guide. It's the integration architecture guide for cloud and hybrid landscapes. So this PDF document, a little bit more than 100 pages, really cover all the different integration styles and use case patterns from an SAP technology perspective. and include further information on topics like process integration, data integration, analytics integration, and so on. And this is really the most comprehensive guide you can get as an integration developer or architect or whatever you do with integration to get more information on SAP's technology strategy in this space. This guide also includes information on some cross topics. I haven't talked about monitoring and application lifecycle management and security so far. So these are also partially covered, but also keep an eye on the hyperlinks in the guide, because for a lot of topics, for example, when it comes to Fiori implementation guidelines, there are also hyperlinks to further documents that you can consult for certain areas. And in the center, this is more or less an extract from the comprehensive guide. The CIO guide is actually a small portion of it, which describes the most important technology topics in a, yeah, let's say, in a high level. I don't want to call it high level, but it doesn't go as deep as the comprehensive integration architecture guide. So if you're interested in the overall intelligent enterprise topic, again, this white paper is your first starting point. Then I would like to point you to the webinars that we've already conducted around the integration strategy, are currently having, because this is also part of the webinar series, and also about the upcoming webinars. For example, the next one will be on December the 9th on the SAP Integration Suite. So my colleague Udo Palzer will talk about the topic there. I also recommend, of course, to have a look at the full list to make sure you don't miss anything here. And this is all part, and this is the third part here, as part of the SAP integration strategy community that is, including a lot of different blog posts and webinars, but also recordings. And make sure to join this community to really stay up to date, not only with the integration solution advisory methodology, but also with all the topics that are related around SAP's integration strategy, because as outlined at the very beginning of this webinar, this is a very broad topic, and this is probably the place where you get the most information around this topic. So what are the key takeaways from this webinar today? Of course, have a closer look at the integration solution advisory methodology. Make sure you really take a look at it. Think about already how you can maybe apply it in your company. Again, it's a very large set of artifacts that we provide here. And maybe it's also, now that you heard a lot of different terminologies here and artifacts, not easy to understand how the relation between all the artifacts are. And in this case, I would like to point you to the OpenSAP course. It's listed here under number 2. So my colleague Katrin von Asen has created an OpenSAP course that really deep dives into the different steps of our methodology. And you also, as part of this OpenSAP course, have a case study that you can perform or work on during the course, which then allows you to apply the methodology concepts directly to a real life use case. But of course, you could also do it on an example from your company in this case. We have a landing page. You can see it here on top, sap.com/integration-methodology. This is the external landing page for all topics around the integration advisory methodology. You will also find different links to blog posts on the methodology, which also include then the description how to get access to the template. So if you want to make sure, have a look at these blogs, but access is actually gained by dropping us an email. There's an email address that is isam@sap.com, and just request to get access because you've watched this webinar here, and then we will grant access to this template, and you can explore it on your own. And again, with the support of the course, maybe you can dive deeper in here. And if you have any questions or you want to exchange with other customers and partners, and maybe also broaden your horizon on that, engage in the SAP community. So again, the SAP integration strategy community, still brand new compared to other communities, is open for you and allows you to ask questions. And my colleagues and I will then also be happy to assist here. With that, I would like to conclude my webinar. I hope you got some information on our integration solution advisory methodology. I hope you got an impression on the concepts and the ideas behind. Maybe you already have some ideas how you could apply that in your company. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. I don't see any questions right now in the Q&A tool. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Konstantin. At this point, it's also possible for people to raise their hand. Attendees, if you would like to really just speak up, share your thoughts, feedback, or speak out your question instead of submitting it in a written form, then raise your hand and we can unmute you. There was one question in the chat about where the presentation or recording can be found. So on community.sap.com, under events, we have the community calls playlist where you can also access all recent and replays that happened in this year, last year. We also have good feedback in the chat. So Konstantin, maybe you want to see that as well. It was very funny right in the beginning. One attendee had said, how can I apply to be part of the Konstantin team? So I said, I take this as a compliment. But also, there are, of course, the careers website with the open positions. But it seems like, there's no open questions for now. But appreciation shared in the chat. So very, very much thank you for everyone that's participating in the chat and letting us know how you liked this call.
And maybe let me make one last comment. We are also, of course, evolving the methodology, and I haven't talked too much today about certain improvements from methodology side, but you can be sure that we're also working on certain topics like bringing the latest technology rebrandings into the template, but also things that just got launched from the product perspective. The ticket is just over, and of course, we will also provide some more as part of the next version. So the methodology is also a versioned methodology, and of course this is also included then in the next release.
That sounds good. All right, then for now I'll stop the recording. Thank everyone for their attendance and hope to see you in the next community calls soon. And if you do have any questions coming up, then the SAP integration strategy community topic page is your place to raise them.